We're here today to celebrate a day that we're told in the book of Leviticus chapter 23, 24th verse, is a day that we are to observe in the seventh month on the first day of the month. Today is the first day of the seventh month, the new moon at the beginning of the seventh month in God's sacred calendar. We're told that on this particular occasion, we're to have a Sabbath. That, of course, is what we're doing. We didn't go to work. Our children didn't go to school today. We came here to church. We're to have a Sabbath, and we're to have this Sabbath, we're told in verse 24, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. A memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You know, normally you think of a memorial as being something that comes in the aftermath. We celebrate certain days as a memorial because they commemorate, they remember an event that has occurred. And because of that, we celebrate a day in memory of this particular event. We have sometimes termed the Passover service a memorial because Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," or "Do this as a memorial to me. Do this in memory of what I have done." So we sometimes use that expression in reference to the Passover, that it is a memorial that we are we're coming together to remember the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and to cast our minds back on what Jesus Christ did for us. And it is appropriate that we should speak of that as a memorial. It is appropriate that we should view it in that context. But you know, for all of us as human beings who are limited, finite human beings, you and I inhabit time, present time, right here, right now. We inhabit a finite world. We inhabit this physical planet. We inhabit finite, limited space, finite, limited time. And that's really what our minds can comprehend. God, we're told in the Psalms, God inhabits eternity. He inhabits eternity. Your mind and my mind have trouble grasping the whole concept of eternity. God inhabits eternity. We're told of God that He declares the end from the beginning. The prophet Isaiah tells us that God says through Isaiah, "Who can you compare to me? There's none like me who can declare the end from the beginning." God inhabits eternity. God can declare the end from the beginning. The Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Romans that God calls those things that are not as though they were. You grasp that, brethren? God can speak of the future with the same level of certainty that you and I can speak of the past. God can speak of the future with the same level, the same degree of certainty that we can have for the past. We can come together and celebrate a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. We can come together to celebrate a memorial to an event that has not yet occurred. And we can do so with the same level of certainty that we can celebrate the Passover as a memorial of a sacrifice that has been offered. There is the same level of certainty to the remaining portion of the plan of God as there is to that portion which has been completed. The fall festivals are just as sure. The fulfillment of the fall festivals is just as sure as is the fulfillment of the spring festivals. We're here on the first day of the seventh month observing a Sabbath, a holy convocation, a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. We're here to celebrate a day That it's not, well, it might happen, or it could happen, or, perhaps someday. There is a reality and there is a certainty to the event that we are here to celebrate a memorial and observing. Now, how does what we're celebrating here today tie in with the events that we're seeing on the world scene? We have experienced in recent weeks a tremendous upset in what everyone assumed to be sort of the eternal order of things. Can you really imagine the Communist Party being banned in the Soviet Union? I mean, can you imagine a headline comes out, Russian president bans Communist Party? That was literally the headline. We live in a world where we're bombarded by change and we're bombarded by some of these events, and we sort of get where we take them as a matter of course. I'll tell you what, I had my early years and my early thinking shaped very much by the very depth or height, depending on how you want to look at it, of the Cold War. The anti-communist crusades of the 50s and the 60s, the early 60s, the emphasis on Americanism versus communism, and this dichotomy by which the whole world was viewed. The idea, the concept that you've got a headline that comes out just a matter of days ago, Russian president bans Communist Party. That sounds like almost one of these, impossible headlines, headlines we'd love to see, sort of a thing, almost a contradiction in terms. Now, we live in a world that has seen so much change and so much rapid change and such a complete flip-flop of events upside down that if we're not careful, we can be lulled to sleep even by the very nature of rapid change. That so much happens and such startling events take place that we sort of get where we take it for granted. How does what we're celebrating today tie in with the things that we're seeing on the world scene? Let's go back to the book of Revelation and let's look to begin with at a brief overview of things that have yet to happen. Events that are going to occur and that are going to culminate in the fulfillment of the day that we are here celebrating. In Revelation chapter 6, we see Jesus Christ opening the seals. John was handed a scroll that had upon it 7 seals. They sealed up this particular scroll so that it could not be opened. Somebody had to break the seal in order to open it. No one was found worthy to open the scroll. And then Jesus Christ. This is a vision that John had in his vision transported to heaven, seeing this scroll. And Jesus Christ then takes the scroll and begins to unroll it. He begins to open up the events that are contained here on that scroll. Now, the book of Revelation is a revealing. It's not a concealing. It's a revealing. And as he opened the seals, he told John in verse 1 of chapter 6, book of Revelation, come and see. And the first thing he saw was a white horse. And the one that sat on the white horse had a bow and a crown, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. Now, if you go back and you tie that in, we find back in Revelation chapter 19 that Jesus Christ will come on a white horse. Jesus Christ is going to come as King of Kings, as Lord of Lords. He's coming, symbolically is described in Revelation 19, is coming on a white horse. So here is one that in the first seal pictures something that at least has outward similarity with Jesus Christ. Now, in Matthew 24, when Jesus explained to his disciples the things that would come to pass, the first thing he told them would occur would be false prophets. That is what the white horse of Revelation 6:2 makes reference to, false prophets, because while they come on a white horse, while there is a similarity to Jesus Christ, they don't come with a sword, which is the Word of God. They come with a bow that's the symbol of Nimrod, the mighty hunter, the successor of Nimrod, not the representative of Jesus Christ. But here we find the false prophets, those that go forth claiming to represent God, culminating, of course, in that final man of sin, that final son of perdition, that final great world religious leader that is going to represent the culmination of this particular seal. In the aftermath of that, a second seal is opened, and this horse is red, and he has the one that sits on him has the power to take peace from the earth. So here we find in the aftermath of the religious confusion, we find warfare. We find violence. And culminating, of course, in the great military and political leader that will come to power, that will be in a position of power, that will come, who will wage war, claiming to do so for the purpose of bringing peace. We find in the aftermath of that, the third seal being opened, and this is a black horse in verse 5. And here we find the black horse of famine, with a scale and balances in his hand, weighing out, measuring out grain. A rationing of food because of severe famine. Followed by the fourth seal in verse 7, which is, we're told in verse 8, a pale horse. Death and the grave. That ultimately will be responsible for bringing about the death of 1/4 of the world's population. That's over 1 billion people. These seals open up, and of course, once they open, they continue to run. You see, it's not like all the false prophets come and go, and after they disappear, war comes, and then after all the war, there is an order in which these events began to unfold. There is an order in which these events began to unfold, but once they start, they continue. And we have certainly seen the events that have transpired, and obviously some of these things, there have been false prophets, there have been wars, there have been famines, there have been disease epidemics, all through man's history. But we have seen in the modern world a series of events that has begun. The religious confusion, certainly there has been an upsurge and a multiplication of those who have come as false prophets. Going back, there was a multiplication of this sort of thing, really in the beginning of modern reckoning, because we date the modern world as sort of dating back to the period of the 1500s, the period that saw exploration and the Protestant Reformation, and in the aftermath of that, the multiplication of various groups that all claim to represent the truth, and yet it represented a multiplication of error. You know, not only do we have the great whore of Revelation 17, but she is the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, many daughters. We have seen warfare beginning in the aftermath of the French Revolution in the latter part of the last of the 18th century, and the beginning with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. We have seen wars that are different than wars that have ever been before, because the event that took place beginning with the French Revolution was wars that were waged for ideology and wars that involved the entire nation. You know, prior to that, you had wars that took place, but wars were always between small professional armies who were fighting. Now, there may be devastation to civilian population because they got in the way, but you'd never seen, prior to that time, mobilization of an entire population, an entire nation against other entire nations. The entire armies, the armies of all of the European wars, if you look in the 1700s and the 1600s and previous to that, you had small professional armies of a few thousand people. Beginning at the time of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, you had the beginning of really the modern world in terms of wars. You had wars that were fought for ideological purposes, wars that involved whole nations, that by the time of World War I, warfare that took place on a destructive scale that so far paled into insignificance. All the wars that man had had before then, the carnage was incredible. There were more people who died in World War I than in the sum total of all European wars as far back as history runs. You have to realize that and the impact that why World War I had such an impact in Europe. There were more people that died during those 4 years than in any other war, or than the sum total of all of the other wars that had ever been fought in Europe, of which there is record. Then World War II came along and topped it. And in World War II, we had then extensive annihilation of civilian populations. We are familiar with the 6 million Jews that Hitler exterminated, but you know, Stalin killed about as many Ukrainians as Hitler did Jews. Ukrainians and Poles and various other groups. He was responsible for actually more civilian deaths when you put in all the purges that he had and just literal extermination of certain portions of population of the Soviet Union. Between the two of them, they managed to wipe out more civilians who were totally non-combatants than again had been the sum total of all the soldiers killed in war in European history. So we're introduced to war on a scale that man had never fought war before. World wars, they were called. We are now setting the scene for the third and final round of those world wars. The third seal, the seal of famine. Within the last decade or the last 15 years, we have seen increasingly the black horse of famine beginning to ride. Beginning through Africa with death from starvation. The full impact of that is only beginning. Because while it may have begun in Africa, it is going to have worldwide implications. The same thing with the fourth seal, the disease epidemics and the deaths. These are things that are going to multiply on a scale that is beyond our imagination. The fifth seal in verse 9 is opened, and this represents the Great Tribulation. John in vision saw in heaven the collective blood of all of God's saints who had been martyred through the centuries crying out for vengeance. Now, you know, this is comparable to what God told Cain. You see, when God asked Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And Cain at first tried to offer an excuse. Dr. Avant talked about excuses. We find excuses going all the way back to Adam blaming Eve and Eve blaming the snake. Man always has had excuses. Cain had excuse. And God said unto Cain, He said, "Your brother's blood cries out from the ground." What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out from the ground. Now, he didn't mean that Abel's blood was, literally had a voice. That's a figure of speech. It is a reference to the fact that the presence of the blood of a righteous man soaking into the ground by its presence demands that a God of justice do something. If the blood of one righteous man cries out for a God of justice to intervene, how much more does the blood collectively of all of the men and women of God down through the centuries, how much more does their blood collectively cry out for God's intervention, God's justice? And the fifth seal, when John sees this, is that yet for a little while they should rest, that the martyrs of God should remain in their graves yet a little while, verse 11 of chapter 6, until their fellow servants and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. So here with the fifth seal, we come to a period, the beginning of the Great Tribulation. We're told in other scriptures that the tribulation is defined as a period of 3.5 years. 1,260 days, 3.5 years begins 3.5 years prior to the return of Jesus Christ. So we're looking at events that began to pick up, events that have some of these seals in that sense have already begun. Some of the horsemen have already begun to ride. And we have in the offing, we have ahead of us a fifth seal that has not yet been opened. And then we're told in verse 12 that after the fifth seal there is a sixth seal. And when the sixth seal occurs, there's a great earthquake. And the sun becomes black, the moon becomes red. There are terrific signs in the heavens of stars falling, and it looks like it looks like a fig tree that's all the fruits falling out at once. Just meteor showers and tremendously impressive and frightening events in the heavens. And we're told in verse 15, the kings of the earth and the great men, the rich men, the chief captains, the mighty men, every bondman and every free, hid themselves in the dens and rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sits on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come. The sixth seal is setting the stage for the day of the Lord, the day of God's wrath, that day of the Lord, that final 1 year period before Christ returns. It's sort of like God saying, let me have your attention, please. I've got an announcement to make. Only when God asks for people's attention, no one's going to ignore this announcement. You know, when the earth begins to quake and tremble and shake, and the sun turns black and the moon turns red and the tremendous meteor showers take place, God's going to have everybody's attention. That's just sort of the warm-up. That's the prelude. That's the prelude for the main event, and that main event is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord begins in chapter 8, verse 1, the seventh seal. The seventh seal is the day of the Lord, and the seventh seal contains, there are 7 trumpets that are blown in the day of the Lord. That's the last year. So here, the tribulation has been in swing for 2.5 years. The nations of Israel, the United States, the British Commonwealth nations, have been in captivity for 2.5 years before the sixth seal, the heavenly signs, take place that signal the beginning of God's intervention. Because you see, the events of the seals represent Satan's wrath. It represents what Satan has stirred up. God then prepares to step into history. God prepares to intervene and announces that intervention. Now, while all of these things are taking place, there are 2 individuals that are explaining what's going on, because you have several things that have transpired. You have the church that is described as the Philadelphia era or phase of God's church, the 6th phase of the church, Philadelphia era, that has been taken on the wings of a great eagle into her place in the wilderness. to be nourished of God for times and a half a time from the face of the serpent. In other words, taken into the place of protection, a place of safety, as we have many times used the term. Technically, that term is not found. It says her place in the wilderness to be nourished. So it is a place of nurturing and nourishment, a place of protection for 3.5 years. The Laodicean phase, the final 7th phase or era of the church, is in the midst of the Great Tribulation. Many of them are suffering martyrdom. Others find themselves in various concentration camps and various places of extreme persecution and tribulation, difficulty. But while that is the case, we find in Revelation 11 and verse 3 that power is given to 2 individuals, 2 witnesses, who are to prophesy during this 1260-day period. They are referred to symbolically back in the book of Zechariah chapter 4. And we're told in verse 5, if anybody seeks to hurt them, fire proceeds out of their mouth, devours their enemies. If any man hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. So here are individuals who are representing God, who under God's divine protection. And anyone who attempts to hurt them or to capture them or to do harm to them is actually swallowed up and consumed by fire. They call fire down just as Elijah called fire down from heaven. So, they don't have to do that too often before people leave them alone. You remember the story you remember the story with Elisha where they were going to come up and take him captive? You remember the story? They sent the soldiers up, sent the troops up to take him captive. Fire came down, swallowed them up. Next bunch came up. Fire came down and got them. The third bunch came up, and they kind of stood a little ways off and said, we have something to ask you. I'd like to make a request. Please, pretty please. If you want to come with us, we would like for you to come, but, hey, we're not trying to give you any orders or anything. They had a little attitude adjustment by what happened to the first 2 groups. So it does wonders for attitude of the persecutors when they get on the receiving end. So God has appointed these 2 individuals who are going to be in Jerusalem. And of course, the beast and the false prophet, the political leader, has actually moved from Europe down to Jerusalem and set up his headquarters there. The religious leader, the Pope, has actually moved from Rome down to Jerusalem and set up his headquarters there. And so they're actually in Jerusalem at the beginning of this 3.5-year period. And while they're there, here are these 2 individuals that are coming in that make themselves unpopular in a real big hurry. Anybody that seeks to interfere with them is burned up. They have the power to shut the heavens, and it rains not in the days of their prophecy. So they're in a position to stop the rain. That can aggravate famine real quickly. They have power over the waters to turn them to blood and to smite the earth with all the plagues as often as they will. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them and overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of that great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. So where's that? That's Jerusalem. The people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and they won't even allow them to be put in their graves, won't allow them to be buried. They that dwell upon the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and send gifts to one another. Sounds like Christmas, doesn't it? Because these 2 prophets tormented them that dwell on the earth. Now, how is everybody all over the earth going to see their dead bodies? Well, I guess CNN will be there covering it live. Peter Arnett. Right there. All over the world. People are going to see. And they're going to have viewed these 2 individuals who have been God's representatives as the source of all the problems. They're going to have viewed these 2 individuals as the source of all the problems. And when finally they are allowed by God to be killed, celebration breaks out. They think, finally our trouble is over. We've won. We've finally gotten rid of those guys. And so, sort of a public mockery is made of them. It drags on for 3.5 days. But verse 11, after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood on their feet. And great fear fell upon them which saw it. You better believe, right, all of a sudden the party's over. I mean, here they are, really whooping it up. And these two corpses that are laying out there, all of a sudden they stand up and dust themselves off. And great fear comes on those that see that. Uh-oh. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. In the same hour there was a great earthquake. And they know they're in trouble. Now, there's a great woe, or there is a great earthquake. The second woe is past, and the third woe comes very quickly. Now, the first and second woe represent the fifth and sixth of the 7 trumpets. The 2 witnesses have been in Jerusalem from the beginning of this 3.5-year period. And they are there announcing God's message. They're there proclaiming and announcing these things. And then beginning with the day of the Lord, beginning with that final year, they began calling down plagues that are defined right here, the trumpet plagues. You see, Revelation 8 tells us that when the 7th seal was opened, 7 angels stood before God to whom were given the 7 trumpets. And in verse 6 of Revelation 8, the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. And a third part of the trees was burned up, and the green grass was burned up. Now they had already stopped the rain, so everything was pretty dry. And when all of a sudden there came this great hailstorm and lightning flashing all over the place, there were fires that just broke out worldwide because everything was dry as tinder. And we find that this was something that was going to pale the Kuwaiti oil field fire into insignificance because it burns up and destroys a third part of the grass and trees. You talk about forest fires and wildfires sweeping over vast areas. Can you imagine you've already had 2 years where there hasn't been any rain? How dry do you think things are? 2 years without any rain. Water has already begun to be seriously rationed. Now these individuals call for a plague. When it comes God's time, they announce it, and it comes, just like the plagues that God sent on Egypt. You see, Moses and Aaron, in that sense, were like a type of the 2 witnesses. They went in before Pharaoh and his magicians, and they announced they announced what God was going to do, and God did it. And they called down tremendous plagues. And Pharaoh and his soldiers couldn't bother Moses and Aaron because God was protecting them. These 2 individuals are going to God will empower them with that same level of power. So, all of a sudden it comes time, for God to step in. The heavenly signs have occurred. We're in that final year, and this tremendous storm takes place of hail, just a vehement storm worldwide. Never been anything like that. Lightning, when it talks about hail mingled with hail and fire, you've got lightning, the most terrific lightning storm you can imagine, but occurring on a worldwide scale. Vast areas are ignited. The drought makes it impossible to effectively fight those fires, and we have taking place over a period of weeks, literally a third of the forest and grassland are consumed. And then the second angel sounds, and it's as though a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, a great meteor. comes down out of heaven and crashes into the sea, and a third part of the sea becomes like blood. And a third part of the creatures in the sea die, and shipping is destroyed, a third of that. Now it says that these two prophets, these two witnesses we saw in Revelation 11, have power over the waters to turn them to blood. In Revelation 11 and verse 6, they call down this plague. That occurs. And then in verse 10 of Revelation 8, the third angel sounds, and a great star from heaven fell. Another great meteor that comes down that fell, and this time fresh water was contaminated. A third part of that became poison. So here you've got major devastation. And then in verse 12, a fourth angel sounds, and we see tremendous upset heavenly conditions that sees the sequence of day and night upset. Talks about the sun and the moon were not visible for 1/3 of the time that they normally would be. That it was like they were darkened a third part of the time. And it was just incredibly bewildering to people and frightening, overwhelming. And then an angel flew through heaven, saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpets of the three angels which are yet to sound." God is stepping into history. These trumpets symbolize the warning of God's intervention. 4 of the trumpets are past. And the fifth angel then sounds in chapter 9, verse 1. And we see the bottomless pit opened up, this great abyss that had contained the beast power and its great armies. And they are allowed to go forth and to launch an attack that is not going to further devastate any of the vegetation on the earth, but it is weapons that will torment individuals that sound sort of like some sort of weaponry that will have an effect of perhaps causing nerve damage and things of this sort that will result in tormenting people, but will not actually destroy life and property, but will just make things almost unbearable. This is a 5-month duration mentioned in Revelation 9 and verse 5. Now this sort of sets the stage. This is what's called the first woe. This represents an attack by the European power, by the beast. Now, who are they attacking at this point? Well, back in Daniel chapter 11, we see that the event that marks the onset of the tribulation, the event that sets the stage for the onset of the tribulation, is mentioned in Daniel 11:40. At the time of the end, the king of the south will push at the king of the north. And the king of the north will come at him like a whirlwind and enter into the Middle East and enter into the area, the land of Judea and Jerusalem, verse 41. Enter into the whole Middle Eastern area and occupy it. And he will have power, verse 43. Verse 44 says, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he will go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly make away many. Now this attack by the beast power on the areas of the north and the east, the areas of Asia, represent the first woe. Now let's set the stage. We went into the fact on Sabbath, the significance of the events that are taking place in the Soviet Union. And how ultimately, when the final revival of the Roman Empire arises, that final and seventh revival of the Roman Empire, it is represented by the 2 feet on the 2 legs of the image in Daniel 2. The 2 legs represented the western side of the Roman Empire and the eastern Roman Empire. Their continuation on down and their culmination in what are described as 10 toes, 5 toes on each foot, symbolizing 10 kings. In other words, there is going to come together 10 kings who Revelation 17 tells us will have not yet received power, but will, and they will give their power to the beast for a period of short duration. They will voluntarily relinquish and give up some of the authority they possess, will pool their resources to this great political military leader who they view as the one who's going to be able to prevent the total collapse of this great, powerful economic trading combine they have built or are in the process of building. They're threatened because of events that are taking place in the Middle East. They're threatened and feel threatened because of events and some of the problems and things that are taking place in our country. They give their power to this great leader who will emerge. And he, together with the religious leader, who will actually be the one to sort of point him out and to point them toward the religious leader, will point them in the direction of this military political leader and will in effect anoint him, will choose him, and these 10 kings, these 10 leaders, 5 of which are going to come from the continuation of the Western Empire. In other words, the Latin, German, Catholic realm. 5 of which will come from the remnant, of the Eastern Empire, the Slavic Orthodox realm. That's what part of the events and part of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the disappearance of communism, at least on the surface, sets the stage for. You've got a union, but we're told in Daniel 2 that it will be at its best a very shaky union. It will be iron mixed with miry clay. It will be partly strong and partly brittle. Because even though they come together and they give unity, because the Catholics and the Orthodox and all of these various groups will have been reconciled and brought together under this final great religious leader, who will be able to seemingly put Humpty Dumpty back together again, you see. Mr. Rice was commenting this morning about how he'll work great miracles, lying wonders, things that'll be impressive. And so, there's a vacuum, and there is a vacuum of faith. Certainly a vacuum of faith that exists in the Eastern Bloc, because communism as a religion is dead. Line Russian generals and a couple of Harvard professors, there's probably nobody left that believes in it anymore. It's failed. People here at one time was something that people believed in. They trusted it to deliver them, to bring them peace and prosperity. It was the wave of the future. That faith is gone. It's crumbled. They realize they've been lied to. And as a result, they're filled with animosity and bitterness against those who've lied to them. It's setting the stage for this coming together in Europe. A final seventh revival of the Roman Empire, putting the whole thing back together. German-led, involving Western and Eastern Europe. They will come in, make an attack in the Middle East. Will come in and occupy the Middle East. They will attack the nations of Israel, United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, British Commonwealth nations. They will wipe out those that they see as the enemy to peace and progress. They will launch this intense period of religious persecution to force everyone into conformity. But during that time, the two witnesses are going to be in Jerusalem. They're going to be God's representatives and God's witnesses in the midst of this. God's people, God's church, will either be those who are faithful in a place of protection, those who have been wishy-washy, lukewarm, straddling the fence, sort of, not totally in, not totally out, not really on fire about it. I'll tell you what, looking down the muzzle of a gun or down the point of a bayonet, you get on one side of the fence or the other real quickly. So the Laodiceans witness to God their faithfulness by martyrdom, by persecution. The voice of God's work has been silenced except for these two witnesses, but they're getting worldwide coverage. And you see, as this situation goes on and on, here is the religious leader. He's supposed to be the great power of God. He's been doing all these great lying wonders. He's supposed to have the inside connection. He has proclaimed that He is God in the flesh. He will say that he will stand in the temple of God claiming that He is God. That's what we're told in Thessalonians. Son of perdition, whom Christ will destroy with the brightness of His coming. Don't you think that as time goes by, the two witnesses are going to begin to cast a little doubt on His credibility? Sure they are. And as things continue on and somehow He's unable to do anything about it, it's not going to make Him look too good. The situation is going to continue to deteriorate. And finally, beginning with the day of the Lord, when God steps in and begins to intervene, and the heavenly signs occur, and the two witnesses then begin to pull down, to bring down major plagues that literally devastate the planet within a matter of months. You know what's going to happen? The credibility of the false prophet is going to begin to fall to an all-time low. There are going to be rumblings because, you see, there are those who really are going to be a little bit skeptical in their belief at the best of times. And where would you expect to find some of those any more than out in the areas of Asia? Places like China and the areas of Soviet Central Asia and many of the areas of the Soviet Union. People who, to one extent or another, have gone along with this, but began more and more to be bothered by what they view as this guy isn't everything he's cracked up to be. They've brought us into this union and it was supposed to provide peace and prosperity. We've been had. This guy can't do what he claims he can do. He can't deliver the goods. He's a fraud. They weren't too sold on religion at the best of times. They sort of went along with this because this looked pretty impressive. But now they've seen something that's equally impressive and they're not prepared to obey it. But they sort of have lost their fear and began to feel that they've been had. And plus the fact they don't like the way that Germany is running the Middle East. They don't feel like they're getting their fair share. So what happens is there begins to be tidings out of the east and out of the north. Begins to be rumblings over in Asia. Well, the military leader, European military leader, he never trusted that bunch anyway. He just used them and he's had them in, but he never really trusted them. So he decides the solution is a preemptive attack, that he will launch a sneak attack. They've perfected these new bombs, that they'll just bomb the fire out of some of this area and really cow them into submission, put a stop to any ideas of coups or overthrows or pullouts of the new Roman Empire. Well, when he does that, that's going to set the stage for the sixth angel sounding, the sixth trumpet, the second woe, which is going to result in a loosing of the four angels bound in the great river Euphrates that are going to be prepared to gather an army of 200 million, which has to come from Asia, India, China, portions of Russia, to slay a third part of men. You see, what are we told in Revelation 17? The time is going to come, the 10 kings who've given their power to the beast, the time is going to come when they're going to hate the whore. They're going to come to hate that religious system because they're going to realize that it was a fraud and they've been lied to. Centered there in portions of what's now the Soviet Union, after this sneak attack that the beast launches on Asia, there are going to be rumblings in the European part of the Soviet Union, because those people, you see, have always been sort of balanced between East and West. East in the sense of connections with Asia, with China, with the Mongol nations, and they have been always torn between their ties in the direction of the East and their ties in the direction of the West. There have been times when they've looked East. There have been times when they've looked West. Their history in the Soviet Union or in Russia has sort of gone back and forth. When this preemptive attack that is the first woe, the fifth angel sounding, takes place, this attack on Asia, that's going to push them over the brink. They're going to feel like they've been set up. They're going to, by this time, the economy and worldwide trade and so much is going to be in such a shambles with these catastrophic events that have taken place. They're going to look and say, you know, we're not better off. In fact, the Germans have done it to us again. So they're going to, you know, perhaps there'll be some sort of readjustment. You know, there's no one who can be in a position of power right now who's not been on both sides. You know, anybody who comes to power in the East Bloc, no matter how anti-communist some of these politicians and leaders may claim to be today, the way they rose to power to begin with was there was a time when they were good communists or they never would have been in a position to have gotten power, whether you're looking at Yeltsin or Gorbachev or anybody else. They rose to power through the party. They've been on one side, now they're on the other. Well, when you put it together with what Jeremiah says, that the Medes, the area there of European Russia and Ukraine, is going to be responsible for putting together something that is literally going to annihilate Rome and leave it as simply a nuclear crater. That's going to be in connection with this second woe, this great, gigantic Eurasian army coming out of the east that begins to pour across the river Euphrates, because they're going to recognize they're going to launch an attack. They're going to destroy Rome, the center. They're going to bring this gigantic army into the Middle East. They don't want to launch nuclear weapons to destroy the Middle East, because to do that is to destroy all the oil and all the wealth. There's no way they can pour on the nuclear weapons in the Middle East and have anything left after they finish. They evidently don't have the kind of bombs that the Europeans, the Germans had, that are able to torment life and not destroy vegetation. So they come in with this gigantic army that pours across, and they launch a gigantic attack that devastates much of Europe. Revelation 9:18 says, by these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire and by the smoke and the brimstone. So a nuclear exchange begins to take place. Then we see in verse 7 of Revelation 10, the voice of the seventh angel. When it will begin to sound, the mystery of God will be finished. As we come on forward and pick up the story again, we find in Revelation chapter 14. Well, Revelation 11:14 says the second woe is past, the third woe comes quickly. The two witnesses are killed at the end of the second woe, right after this great nuclear attack. Because you see, they've already shown they've shown the false prophet up to be a fraud. Any credibility he had, particularly in the East and among the political leaders that have sort of all united and pooled their resources he's already been shown up to be a fraud. They don't believe in him. They certainly don't believe he represents the power of God anymore. So they're not afraid to attack him. His credibility's been undermined. So everything has fallen apart. You see, the whole thing was part of iron, part of miry clay. It wasn't going to stick together very long anyway. There were too many hatreds, too many distrusts, too many animosities, too many resentments and mistrust that went back for too many centuries. It was an alliance of convenience that comes together for a short time because people are swept up in the emotions of something that they're greatly impressed with, and it promises peace and prosperity. But it's a lie. It's based on a lie. It won't last, won't endure. And so, when the second woe is past, the third woe comes very quickly. The seventh angel sounds, verse 15. And the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of His Christ, and He'll reign forever and ever. The seventh angel sounds. And the result of the seventh angel sounding is described in Revelation 15. Seven angels having the seven last plagues that constitute the seventh trumpet. They began to pour out these plagues. Chapter 16 and verse 2. A great sore, a disease, comes upon those that have accepted the mark of the beast, have given their continued loyalty and allegiance to this false religious system. Immediately thereafter, the rest of the sea becomes blood. Immediately thereafter, the rest of the fresh water becomes blood. There is upset conditions in the heaven, and the earth wobbles in its orbit, and there are great solar flares. There's scorching heat. And darkness falls on Europe, the area of the seat of the beast. All of this occurring just almost simultaneously with one another, and just as these events happen, the river Euphrates dries up and the kings of the east pour across. This gigantic invasion of 200 million. They pour across into a place called Armageddon. And as the seventh vial is poured out, a voice from heaven says it's done. There's a great earthquake such as has not been since the world was. Completely, it is so devastating that the topography of the earth is literally rearranged. God has stepped into history. Because that is the point at which Jesus Christ will have returned. As the seventh angel has sounded and these events begin to take place, Jesus Christ will be descending from heaven. And the dead in Christ will wake up. Graves will open. God's servants who've served Him down through the centuries will wake up. Not in an old, worn out, broken down, physical body, but in a great glorified spirit body. And from all over the world, these glorified beings will begin to emerge and to rise up. And those of us that are alive and remain will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. Our bodies in a moment. Those who are converted, those who have God's Spirit, who are still alive as they see the dead rising up, their bodies will change. This mortal will put on immortality. The ground will begin to disappear under our feet and we'll begin to rise straight up. The angels will come and gather us. And we will assemble with Jesus Christ in the air over Jerusalem, having literally, you talk about a front row seat to observe all these things. How would you like to be watching from a couple of miles up and have the eyesight to be able to see it close up as you want? As these events begin to take place, these armies then, as they realize, they don't fully grasp, particularly some of the Asians, maybe they're going to think it's an invasion from outer space or something. Because all these armies pooled together, here they've come to try to smash one another at Armageddon. As Jesus Christ returns to Jerusalem and His feet stand on the Mount of Olives, this great earthquake, here these armies surge down from Armageddon against Jerusalem to decide that they're going to, temporarily bury the hatchet and attack this invader from outer space. And the armies are literally going to be obliterated. To where the valley of Jehoshaphat outside Jerusalem is going to be filled with blood about 3 or 4 feet deep. There's going to be a horrible carnage. Jesus Christ will have stepped into history. He's going to begin the regathering of the outcasts of Israel. Isaiah chapter 27. Isaiah chapter 27. And verse 13 says, it'll come to pass in that day the great trumpets shall be blown. They're going to come that were ready to perish in the land of Assyria and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and they're going to worship the eternal in the holy mount of Jerusalem. He's going to begin a great gathering in. That great trumpet is blown. That trumpet that signals God stepping into history. It signals the first resurrection, the return of Jesus Christ, judgment on the nations of this world, regathering and relief to the outcast of Israel. We're told in Isaiah 27, verse 6, He's going to cause them that come of Jacob to take root. Israel shall blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit. Here these outcasts are going to be gathered in and brought back. Jesus Christ is going to set His hand to save the world. For a period of time, and certainly prophecy in the book of Daniel indicates at least a 3.5-year period, we're going to be right there working directly under Jesus Christ in the Middle East, in the land of Israel. Working to build a model nation that will be an example to the world. It will be the beginning of peace and prosperity. Peace and prosperity that will spread out to the whole world. In the book of Micah, chapter 4. Micah chapter 4, it says in verse 1, in the last days, it'll come to pass, the mountain of the house of the eternal shall be established in the top of the mountains. It'll be exalted above the hills. People shall flow into it. And many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the eternal, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us of His ways, and we will walk in His paths, for the law shall go forth out of Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He'll judge among many people, rebuke strong nations afar off, and they'll beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation won't lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. That's not going to happen just instantly, snap of the finger. Everybody's lovey-dovey and all at peace. We're looking at a period of years. A period of years of bringing the world under the government of God. It's very clear from Ezekiel 38 that several years into the millennium, perhaps 3.5, 4, 5, several years into the millennium, enough time that Israel has begun to prosper, that there's going to be another invasion from the area of Asia, this time headed up by the area of Gog and Magog, headed up by some leader over perhaps in the area of sort of a modern day Genghis Khan, the area of Soviet Central Asia and China and India and much of certainly portions of the Soviet Union, or what is now the Soviet Union, what has been at least, that there's going to come several years into the millennium, within, let's say, the first 5 or 6, Ezekiel 38 shows how there's going to come an army that's going to come up to the land of unwalled villages. They're going to come up to take a prey because they're going to see a defenseless area. They still will not have gotten the point. We find from Zechariah 14, Egypt's not going to want to come up for the Feast of Tabernacles for a while. God's going to have to not give them any rain. So there are going to be those that have hard lessons to learn. There are going to be others that are going to say, look, we've had enough. Won't you please come and teach us of your ways? We want what you have. There's strong nations afar off that are going to have to be rebuked. There are those that are weak, that'll be like helpless little lambs that'll be taken up and carried and nurtured. There are those that are going to come seeking help. There are those that are going to have a little more rebellion knocked out of them. But the point is that within a matter of a few years, all of the rebellion will have been put down. Strong nations far off will have been rebuked. War-making implements will be destroyed. Nation will not be allowed to lift up sword against nation anymore. And we're told in verse 4 of Micah 4, they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. That's going to be the result. There's finally going to come peace and prosperity. The nations seek security, they seek peace, they seek prosperity. Those aren't wrong things. There's a quote today in the newspaper that really, when you understand it, is so tragically sad. Great celebrations going on in Lithuania celebrating their independence. The Catholic Cardinal of Lithuania was quoted as saying, this is the happiest day of my life. This is the happiest day of my life. Finally, after 50 years of slavery, we're free. The tragedy. These people, what do they want? They want the same things you and I want. They want peace. They want prosperity. They want freedom. They want the benefits and the blessings that they identify with the West that they know their system failed to give. The tragedy, brethren, is they're going to get caught up in another system that if anything is going to be worse than what they've left behind. But the good news that we're here to memorialize today is the fact that time is going to come when the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that shall never be removed. The God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will judge among the nations, that will rebuke strong nations afar off, that will produce a society where every man is able to sit under his own vine, his own fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. Everybody will be given their portion, their inheritance. And nobody's going to be there to threaten to take it away. Won't be any terrorists. There won't be any of those things. Isaiah 25 describes it as a time when the God of heaven will make a feast of fat things for all the world. The Scriptures describe it also as a time when the knowledge of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. A time when the knowledge of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. A time of peace, a time of prosperity. A time that is ushered in by a lot of chaos, a lot of problems, a lot of tragedy, a lot of trauma that represent the consequences of man's 6,000 years of human misrule under the inspiration of Satan. Jesus Christ is going to return to this earth. And those that are with Him, we're told in Revelation 17, those that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. Those that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. Brethren, you and I have been called. We've heard the announcement. We've heard the proclamation. We've heard the call. God has chosen us to receive the first fruits of His Spirit. It remains for us to be faithful. And if we are, then we have the opportunity of being part of the solution to the heartache that grips the world. There's a yearning to be free. There's a yearning for peace, for prosperity. Parents who don't want to see their children go off to war anymore. Yugoslavia, mothers in Serbia came and surrounded the capital there at Belgrade. And they said, don't send our boys to kill. We don't want our sons being sent to kill. They don't want it. Down through the centuries, time after time, young men going forth, killed, wiped out in the flower of their very beginning of their manhood. How many graves? How much death? How much destruction? Over and over and over again. The causes that these men have died for, most of them have long since been forgotten and swept away. The futility. In Romans chapter 8, we're told in verse 20 that the creation was made subject to vanity, subject to being temporary, not willingly, but by reason of Him who has subjected the same in hope. Because the creation, the creature, the creation itself shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. Not only they, but ourselves also who have the first fruits of the Spirit. The whole creation groans and travail. The world is in labor pain. The whole creation has been subject to vanity. But it's been subjected in hope. It's going to be delivered from the bondage of corruption. We're here to celebrate that. Because when we step out into immortality, when we put on immortality at the resurrection, when we step out of the mortal realm and into the family of God, what are we told here? The Spirit itself, verse 16, bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. If so be that we suffer with Him, we may be also glorified together. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of God. The creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of God. The world is waiting on us because that signals the beginning of the completion of God's great plan. We're told in Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. For whom He did foreknow, He did predestinate to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren. Jesus Christ, we're told in Colossians 1:18, is the firstborn from the dead. But when Jesus Christ came up out of the grave at the resurrection and stepped out in that glorified spirit body, that was not the end of God's plan. That was the beginning. Because what are we told here? Whom He did foreknow, you and I, He did predestinate to be conformed to the image of His Son. God called us to make us like Jesus Christ. To be conformed to that image spiritually and ultimately to become like that. To be conformed to the image of His Son, that He, Christ, might be the firstborn among many brethren. Colossians 1:18 says He was the firstborn from the dead. He might be the firstborn among many brethren. Because what are we told? That if we're children, then we're heirs. Heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. Obviously, as we understand, certainly, Mr. DeKoch is stressed, and I think we understand, that doesn't mean that we're going to have the same level of wisdom and power as Jesus Christ Himself. He's always going to be our elder brother. We're certainly not going to have the same level of wisdom and power as God the Father. He's always going to be the Father. Even Jesus Christ said, "My Father is greater than I." He's certainly going to, God the Father is always going to be God the Father, and He's always going to be far greater than any of us in the family. And Jesus Christ is going to be next under Him, the elder brother. We're also going to be part of the family, because He's going to be the firstborn among many brethren. Or He is the firstborn, and He's going to be so among many brethren, because you see, God's plan didn't end when Jesus Christ came out of the grave. That represented the beginning. We're here to memorialize the beginning of the culmination of that great plan. You see, we've been predestinated to be conformed to the image of His Son, so that He will be the firstborn among many brethren. Whom He did predestinate, them He called. Whom He called, He justified. Whom He justified, He glorified. What shall we say then? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not much more with Him freely give us all things? God has done all that He's done, and He went through the sacrifice of His only begotten Son in your behalf and in mine. You think God has done all of that to bring about this great plan, and then He's not going to give us the help to make it? You know, sometimes people say, "Well, I don't know if I'm going to make it. I hope I make it." Brethren, it is the Father's good pleasure to give to you the kingdom. God wants you there. The whole plan and purpose of God revolves around bringing many sons unto glory. God is in the process of bringing us into His family. He that spared not His own Son. Where do you think God's going to draw the line? He didn't draw the line at sacrificing Jesus Christ to save you and me. Who's going to lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It's God that justifies. Verse 35, who's going to separate us from the love of Christ? No, I'm persuaded, he says in verse 38, that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. The God of heaven is going to step into history. He's going to set up a kingdom. The God of heaven is going to smash this world system that is emerging, and He's going to establish a kingdom that shall never be removed. And the place to be is there with Him. We're told in Psalm 16:11 that at His right hand there is fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore. What God has in store for those that believe Him, He inspired Paul to tell us in 1 Corinthians that it is not entered into the hearts of man. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has it entered into the hearts of man the things which God has prepared for them that love Him. You and I can't even fully imagine what it's going to be like to step into eternity, to step into immortality, to be a part of the very family of God. That's beyond our grasp, really. But we know this, that at His right hand there's fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore. 1 John 3:1 tells us that it does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know this, that when He shall appear, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. We're going to be given the same kind of glorified, powerful spirit body that Jesus Christ put on at the resurrection. Hebrews 10 tells us that we've gone through certain things. We've gone through problems and trials and difficulties. And we're told in verse 35 of Hebrews 10, cast not away therefore your confidence, which has great recompense of reward. You have need of patience, that after you've done the will of God, you might receive the promise. For yet a little while, and He that shall come will come, and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. If any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. Brethren, yet a little while, and He that shall come will come. He really, really will. We're here to memorialize a day that has not yet been fulfilled, but we can memorialize it because the fulfillment of this day This Feast of Trumpets, we're here to celebrate a memorial to the blowing of trumpets, because the blowing of those trumpets culminating in the final seventh trump is just as sure, just as absolutely sure, as is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, which we memorialize at the Passover. Yet a little while, and he that shall come will come and will not tarry. That day is coming, which the God of heaven is going to step in. The whole creation groans and travails, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. Brethren, God has called you and me to be those sons, to be there with Jesus Christ at His return. Who's going to be there? Those who are called and chosen and faithful. Brethren, be faithful to the end.